Now, imagine a place that embodies the essence of Walt Whitman's vision. A society where every individual is viewed as unique, a living poem. In such a place, personal integrity, love for the earth, advocacy for justice, and embracing the full spectrum of human experience would not be merely ideals, they would be the foundation of daily life. Such a place would exist because the people there challenged the established forms and norms in order to create a realm of liberty in self-expression, in personhood, and in social participation. Those things would flourish for all. In such a world, social norms would perpetually evolve with the human imagination, and positive change would not only be possible, but it would be a joy every day. Each of us would be purposeful at work, writing the great poem that is our articulation of a free and responsible human being, living freely ourselves, creating conditions of freedom for all sentient beings. This is a vision of liberty itself, democracy itself, and in social participation that is the free thought tradition. That represents it and states it well, I think. And this congregation helped birth that vision well before 1881, which I was talking about last week. The journey towards transformation is deeply rooted in our free thought humanist tradition, a path carved by the relentless pursuit of inclusivity, understanding, and love. It's about dismantling the barriers imposed by custom and taboo and unjust laws. And today I want to accomplish two things in talking with you. First, to establish in your mind where First Unitarian Society stands today as a beacon for free thought and free living, and to solidify this position in order for us to go into new battles for free thinking and free living in a nation that has paradoxically become both more liberal, as you mentioned, and also less so. It is a paradox. A recent book that discusses the current of free thinking that led to humanism and that continues here today is by the scholar of religion Lee Eric Schmidt. The book is titled The Church of St. Thomas Paine, A Religious History of American Secularism. Dr. Schmidt writes, to include religion in the history of 20th century secularism requires moving beyond the politically charged reign of secular humanism, the great whipping boy. That entails, in part at least, recovering the sectarian distinctiveness and minority standing of those humanistic projects that sought to give secularism religious significance of one kind or another. I will repeat that. It's a little complex, but it's absolutely essential to understanding this place. That entails, he writes, in part at least, recovering the sectarian distinctiveness and minority standing of those humanistic projects that sought to give secularism religious significance of one kind or another. That is this place. Schmidt examines the congregations that exist today that are based on that tradition of free thought, and he writes, still another example is John Dietrich's old church, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, which embraces its historic role as a humanist pulpit and continues to cultivate that congregational identity. Schmidt continues, likewise, the Ethical Societies of New York, St. Louis, Philadelphia, and Chicago, those are our sister congregations, retained active presence in their respective cities, evidence of a long institutional shadow cast by the late 19th century. Why aren't other Unitarian Universalist congregations like this? Why don't they make the book? Well, it's a very complex story. It's a story that's really hasn't been written yet in this religious ferment that was the late 19th century. It's complicated. I highly recommend Dr. Schmidt's book Also, Restless Souls. It's probably the most readable of his books, and if you want to know anything about where liberalism and religion comes from, this is essential reading, I think. The Making of American Spirituality from Emerson to Oprah. All right? It's the best summary I know about that complexity of the late 19th century. That's the most accessible of Schmidt's books. Another is Village Atheists, how America's unbelievers made their way in a godly nation. One of the truisms of the 19th century was that each village had only one atheist, which wasn't exactly true, shall we say. Now, Schmidt's book, Heaven's Bride, The Unprintable Life of Ida C. Craddock, American mystic, scholar, sexologist, martyr, and madwoman, zeroes in on the most tragic story of free thought from this particular era. Ida C. Craddock was jailed for disseminating birth control information through the U.S. mail. That's one of the things the Liberal League I was talking about last week were trying to fight. She refused to stop sending out material about healthy sex, spent time in prison, and she took her own life before she was to return to prison. Now, was she insane? Or was she merely a Victorian-era woman talking about having sex and enjoying it? That is the history of what we're talking about here. Norms stomping on human beings. Now, last week I talked about the beginnings of this congregation as a chapter of the Liberal League fighting those U.S. mail policies that ultimately hounded Ida C. Craddock to death. Many terms were floating around at the time. Finally, humanist became the term for those of us who gather in some kind of religious community to be among other human beings, but we don't listen to religious traditions. The human responsibility of being a being among other beings is what we've always been about. The concept of freedom based in this tradition describes not only a state of being, it's an ongoing state of becoming. And that is influenced by thinkers such as Walt Whitman. These individuals, each in their unique way, challenge us to rethink our notions of freedom and justice and morality. For instance, Thomas Paine's advocacy for deism and reason over scriptural fundamentalism, and Whitman's call to love the earth with all its imperfections, underscore a fundamental belief in individual integrity and conscience. It's an achieved selfhood that, when achieved, propels us to fight for the liberation of all humans and other sentient beings. Why is the title of Schmidt's book, The Church of St. Thomas Paine, A Religious History of American Secularism? What could possibly be a secular church? I read you the 9 demands of the Liberal League, all basically trying to get Christianity out of the de facto theocracy that we live in even today. A secular church was the goal all along. And Thomas Paine was the greatest fighter for secularity among the so-called founding fathers, such a fighter that he has been more or less edited out of the story. During the late 19th century, there was a concerted effort to keep him out of it. But let's look at what he had to say. In his most egregiously anti-religious work, The Age of Reason, Paine wrote, "I believe in one God and no more, and I hope for happiness beyond this life. I believe the equality of man, and I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy." Oh, I don't see any religion there. A few lines further down, he wrote, "My own mind is my own church." It's been paraphrased in several ways. That's the way he actually said it. My own mind is my own church. Notice that he says, "I believe that religious duties consist in doing justice, loving mercy, and endeavoring to make our fellow creatures happy." That's what will become humanism eventually in this congregation. Religious devotion is about making our fellow creatures happy. Happy is not a particularly good way of saying that, but that was the translation of the time for this euphonia, this way of living into a happy state of being. This line of thought leads inevitably to the concept of social justice, doesn't it? If you're going to live in this world, you're going to insist that others can live well in it as well. And that's the ideas that we have never given up. But where do we get the idea of a so-called higher law? We don't say, God told me to do this. Where do we get it? That's been a question for a long time. In a theocracy, the answer is easy. God's representatives on earth tell the governmental powers what God wants. The human government enacts and enforces God's laws, and moreover, God's good citizens exact just punishment on individuals who are not obeying God's laws, which happens also to be, well, they become taboos and social norms of the people. They put people like Ida C. Craddock in prison and hound them to death because they know what God says. It's a vicious circle that leads to honor killings, mob violence, and the list goes on. Enforcement of social norms. Where do people get the idea that they even should do that? Neighbors police neighbors and enforce assumptions about what God wants. That's the social world I was born into, and many of you as well. It's a little better these days. Unfortunately, many people today still live in that world, especially in rural areas, in towns, villages, the kind of place I was born. Probably the weight of that immovable stone of social opinion is why Henry David Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience, hit me so hard for the first time. Thoreau's work, along with Emerson's, is why Walt Whitman could write, quote, "Re-examine all you have been told at school or church or in any book. Dismiss whatever insults your own soul, and your very flesh shall be a great poem." Thoreau put it simply, I was not born to be forced, he says. I will breathe after my own fashion. Let us see who is the strongest. Thoreau even sounds Whitmanesque before Whitman started writing. He wrote, my desire for knowledge is intermittent, but my desire to bathe my head in atmospheres unknown to my feet is perennial and constant. And another one, we should treat our minds, that is, ourselves, as innocent and ingenious children whose guardians we are, and be careful what objects and what subjects we thrust on our opinions. Read not the times, read the eternities. Knowledge does not come to us by details, but in flashes of light from heaven. Inspiration, right? Remind yourself that next time you're getting depressed reading the news. Read not the times, read the eternities. Thoreau said about law never did make men a whit more just, and by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made agents of injustice. Agents of injustice. That's what you are if you're listening to the social norms and the God of those social norms. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., the list goes on of people who were inspired by Thoreau's civil disobedience to non-violently resist unjust laws. I think that's why it spoke to me so much when I was 20, 21, along in there. I had always thought that the only way to get a just government was violent, bloody revolution. Well, here was Mr. Thoreau saying there is another way to change how human beings act in the world. Last week, I asked us a rhetorical question: is there a through line in this congregation? What is that through line that has been true from the 1870s through today? And I think there is a through line. That through line is free thinking and thinking freely. free thinking and thinking freely. First Unitarian Society is one of those rare and beautiful human creations, part of the Church of St. Thomas Paine, part of the religious history of American secularism. We've never been religious in a traditional sort of way. One through line for us is an insistence that only the mind, freed from taboo and social norms, those things that too often are part of the religious mindset, are the enemy of free thinking. My own mind is my own church, St. Thomas Paine insisted. And so have most of the ministers and most of the people who have ever attended this congregation. Another through line is that we feel an obligation to joyously dismiss taboos and change social norms and laws so that we may live and think freely. As the great A. Philip Randolph put it, freedom is never given, it is won. Humanist means that each of us accepts the human responsibility of being a being among beings. We're not more important, we just are. And our job is to make everyone, all sentient beings, better off. That is the human responsibility. It's not a divine command for us, because we believe above us is only sky. An authentic self is a self that exists in community with other people. That's another thing we have insisted upon, is that we do need to get this church in our mind out to meet up with others so that we can make a social difference with each other. An authentic self is a self that exists in community with other people. We are our true selves when we not only tolerate but celebrate diversity and uphold the rights of all members of our society. Transformation and liberation beckon us to challenge norms, taboos, and laws, dreaming of a more inclusive world and striving to turn those dreams into actual social freedom for everyone. The question of our day today is about transgender people. Does First Unitarian Society stand in solidarity with transgender people? Well, in our tradition, we don't ask any gods for their opinions. We don't ask society for its prejudices. We ask only, are you writing the great poem that is your true self? That's the question. Are you writing the great poem that is your true self? If so, then you are one of us in our tradition, and we stand in solidarity with you. Remember, go the right way, and continue writing that great poem that is you and us together.